August 29, 1949. The Soviet Union detonates its first atomic weapon at the Semipalatinsk test site in Kazakhstan. Codenamed First Lightning, or Joe-1, the plutonium bomb was a direct copy of the United States Fat Man plutonium implosion device dropped on Nagasaki. To maintain their dominance in the post-World War II environment, Stalin was desperate to obtain the atomic bomb technology. Soviet intelligence had long been aware of the Allies' Manhattan program and their development of the gadget. The Soviets had obtained detailed data from the top-secret project. In particular, the design details of the Fat Man bomb supplied by Klaus Fuchs in 1945. Stalin was also aware, through British double agents, that the US had not begun full-scale production of atomic weapons. By exploding its copy of the American bomb, the Soviet Union had made itself a nuclear power, and subsequently, the second superpower. The Soviets then set about designing their own weapon. It took 2 years before a second, but originally designed bomb was detonated, leveling the playing field. This development was a major jolt to the Americans, who had expected to maintain their strategic dominance for several more years, giving them time to develop the new strategic weapon system. The pressure was on, and the United States focused on combining the two emerging technologies, nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles. The United Nations also reacted to this military development and the dispersal of atomic technology, although little could be done.
The impasse that now exists regarding the international control of atomic energy must be broken, and the Assembly must face this question squarely for the sake of mankind and for the peace of the world.
The US quickly moved their testing and development plans forward and detonated several weapons in the Pacific. They also commissioned studies with aeronautical companies, including the RAND Corporation, to determine the feasibility of a new strategic intercontinental ballistic missile system. Meanwhile, in the New Mexico desert, rocket development was underway. The US Army had contracted General Electric to develop short-range ballistic missiles and surface-to-air missile systems. Called Project Hermes and based at White Sands, New Mexico, GE enlisted the services of Wernher von Braun and his team of German scientists, their aim to transfer as much technical knowledge as possible to US researchers. Under the codename Paperclip, Wernher von Braun and 126 fellow scientists from Peenemünde were resettled at Fort Bliss near El Paso. Some of the scientists had been members of the Nazi Party, and some linked to the slave labor camps utilized to build the vengeance weapons during the war. US officials were of two minds. The scientists had advanced knowledge and technical expertise in rocket construction, but many were also tainted with this suspicion. They kept the team out of the public eye and in isolation, but allowed them to proceed slowly with their work. The bulk of this research consisted of assembling and launching the captured V-2s. Between April 1946 and September 1952, over 64 V-2s were assembled and launched at White Sands. Design modifications and additions to these V-2s included testing an onboard ramjet engine, radar guidance and control, adding a second stage of a WAC Corporal rocket, which was designated Bumper. Half a dozen flew at White Sands and 2 from Cape Canaveral. The Army also fired a V-2 which carried a rhesus monkey called Albert, who became the first animal to fly the rocket. He did not survive the experience. All this research went directly into the development of the Redstone ballistic missile. At this time, a Dr. James Van Allen was assigned the job by Johns Hopkins University to find a sounding rocket to perform high-altitude near-space research. He had found the V-2 too heavy and unsuitable for this work and approached the company Aerojet, who had developed the WAC Corporal rocket for the Army. Aerojet combined their WAC Corporal booster with the first stage developed for the US Navy called a Bumblebee. Hence the Aerobee sounding rocket was created. Fired from a 53-meter-tall launch tower, the Aerobee could take a scientific package weighing up to 68 kilograms to an altitude of 130 kilometers. Including its many variants and improvements, the Aerobee performed some 165 launches between 1948 and 1958. The scientific research gathered was critical for later rocket programs, including the Apollo project. It also allowed Dr. Van Allen to study radiation conditions outside the Earth's atmosphere, a research project that would later lead to an unexpected discovery. 1953 saw the election of the commander of Allied forces during World War II, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, as President of the United States.
After 20 years, the administration had changed hands, and the public met its new president and the incoming First Lady of the land.
Eisenhower embraced the concept of both manned bombers and an intercontinental ballistic missile system as part of the Strategic Nuclear Force. An ICBM was high-speed and unstoppable, able to strike the enemy anywhere in the world with little or no advance notice, delivering the power of the atom. Concerned with the speed of Soviet technological progress, the US intensified efforts to deliver such a system. The missile race was on. The intercontinental ballistic missile got off to a slow and confusing start. All three arms of the US military had their own plans for missile development. The US Air Force commissioned Corvair to research two fields of nuclear weapon delivery. The first was a rocket-powered guided missile with a minimum range of 5,500 nautical miles, a speed of Mach 6, and an error to target of no more than 1,500 feet. This project would become known as the Atlas ICBM. The second commission was for two winged cruise missile designs, able to be rocket-launched, then flown like a conventional aircraft to its target, virtually an unmanned bomber.
Americans shouldered an additional burden in the struggle between East and West, where the race for atomic weapons assumed new proportions and guided missiles took on new importance. The Matador, which someday may carry an atomic charge, was one of America's answers in the armament race, a contest that is the insurance of the free world against slavery.
Taking the bulk of research funding, the SNARC and Navajo systems failed dismally to reach their targets. Cost overruns, design flaws, repeated failure to perform, and constant crashes rang the death knell for both projects. The Atlas project suffered as well. Poorly financed, there were technical difficulties in propulsion, guidance, and nose cone re-entry failure. The Atlas was a stage-and-a-half concept design. Once launched, the booster engines would shut down and separate from the rocket, whilst the center engine or sustainer motor would continue to burn. Late in 1953, the Atlas program got a boost. The Atomic Energy Commission had successfully tested a new high-yield, lightweight nuclear weapon in the megaton range. Weighing between 680 and 1,400 kilograms, the ICBM's payload would be much lighter and therefore more feasible. This breakthrough and the knowledge that the Soviet Union was actively engaged in the missile race prompted the Air Force to rethink their position. The Atlas and Thor programs were accelerated.
1953 for Americans was a year of change. It saw soldier statesman Dwight D. Eisenhower take the oath of office as the nation's first Republican president in 20 years and receive the good wishes of his predecessor, Harry S. Truman. The new chief executive took the reins of government at a climactic moment in the country's history when the solution of foreign and domestic problems pressed for early decision. With a resounding political victory behind him, he faced...
With the death of Stalin in March 1953, Nikita Khrushchev became the first secretary of the Soviet Union. A reformist with a growing power base, Khrushchev wanted to reduce military spending but maintain parity with the US. One option was to use the deterrent effect of strategic ballistic missiles. He encouraged ICBM progress under Dmitry Ustinov, the head of missile development, and their chief designer Sergei Korolev. By early 1954, the Western Development Division of US Air Force was created and put in charge of Atlas and newer Titan systems, specifically to develop and put into active duty at least 3 wings of ICBM missiles. Planned were 120 Atlas and Titan missiles by the early 1960s. The following year saw plans modified. A total of 80 missiles, 40 Atlas and 40 Titan, were approved for Strategic Air Command by March 1961. Von Braun and his team were moved from Fort Bliss to Redstone Arsenal in Alabama, and the Army Ballistic Missile Agency was formed. They developed the Redstone rocket for US ground forces. In 1958, Operation Hardtack used 2 Redstone rockets to launch the first missile-fired nuclear test into the atmosphere over the Pacific Ocean. Following Redstone's success, von Braun developed the Jupiter-C intermediate-range ballistic missile. By August 1956, a Jupiter-C rocket could have launched a satellite into orbit. However, the ABMA was specifically ordered not to attempt a satellite launch. The Soviets, however, were working in great secrecy and at breakneck speed with their R-7 ballistic missile. Weighing in at 280 tons, with a length of 34 meters and a diameter of 3 meters, it could lift a warhead of 3 megatons, 8,800 kilometers, to its target. Chief designer Korolev, although developing nuclear-armed missiles, had his eye on turning these rockets into launch vehicles for satellites and spacecraft, and an opportunity to do so soon arose. Earlier in 1952, the International Council of Scientific Unions announced that due to the upcoming solar activity, July 1957 to December 1958 would become the International Geophysical Year. Scientists from around the world took part in a series of coordinated observations and research groups. In 1954, the group expanded the idea to include a resolution calling for any nation or group to launch an artificial satellite into orbit to map the Earth and carry out other space-based observations. Thus, whoever was the first to launch a satellite into orbit would win the prize and be seen as the most advanced in military technology. In July 1955, the US announced it would participate and called for proposals from its military and scientific branches. A month later, the Soviets, through their legation in Copenhagen, Denmark, also announced their intentions to launch a satellite. The Eisenhower administration wanted a non-military spin on the event and selected Project Vanguard to launch America's first satellite. The Vanguard project was the combination of a Viking and an Aerobee rocket, and was seen as a non-military project development. 4 months into the International Geophysical Year, and Korolev, utilizing his R-7 rocket, trumped every other nation. October 4th, 1957, Sputnik, the first artificial satellite, is hurled into a low Earth orbit. The news stunned the world and ushered in the space age. Sputnik was a small silver ball weighing 83.6 kilograms with 4 trailing antennae. It was carried aloft by the R-7 Semyorka rocket, the first operational ICBM. Codenamed SS-6 Sapwood by NATO forces, the rocket and its strap-on boosters would become the Soviets' principal satellite launcher, and operationally, their ICBM was armed with a 3-megaton warhead. Sputnik's incessant beeping turned the world's eyes up towards the heavens. Being able to put a payload into orbit also meant the Soviets could target a small warhead anywhere on the planet. The US was mortified. Quickly, the government pulled out all stops to end Russia's dominance of space. It also spurred the US military to rush the Thor short-range ballistic missile into service. As a stopgap, the missile was set up in Britain, close enough to target Moscow with a nuclear warhead. The US also took the brakes off von Braun and his Redstone team. A backup to the Vanguard, they were instructed to proceed with the Explorer satellite project. But the Soviets were still ahead. On November 3, 1957, they launched a second Sputnik orbiter. A much heavier satellite, it weighed half a ton and measured 4 meters in height with a 2-meter diameter, proving the Soviets had the capability to launch a large thermonuclear weapon at the US, who are now in a state of panic. It was also a space first, as it carried a passenger, a part Samoyed dog called Laika, the first creature to orbit the Earth. Vanguard was rushed forward. In itself, Vanguard was the most sophisticated rocket designed to date, but it had several technical problems. The planned 7 test launches were scrapped in order to get the satellite into orbit as soon as humanly possible. The Vanguard, designated TV-3, was to have been the 3rd test launch. Suddenly, it was the first operational launch of an American satellite. The eyes of the world were on Vanguard when it lifted off from Launch Pad 18A at Cape Canaveral on December 6, 1957. The flight was an unmitigated disaster and was quickly dubbed the Kaputnik. Vanguard would become the least successful of all American launch vehicles. The Army ABMA and von Braun were immediately given the green light. Von Braun felt vindicated, and Explorer was prepared for launch. Not only was the rocket assembled and prepped at Cape Canaveral in record time, the actual satellite was designed and built at JPL in Pasadena, California, in less than 2.5 months. One of the instrument designers was Professor James Van Allen. With its characteristic spinning section to stabilize the upper stages, Explorer, with its Juno rocket, lifted off from Cape Canaveral on January 31, 1958. America had finally entered the space race. Officially designated Satellite 1958 Alpha, the Explorer probe included a radiation detector which would go on to discover the dense radiation belt surrounding the Earth, eventually named the Van Allen Radiation Belt. Learning from their mistakes and inter-service rivalry, the government moved to form a coherent body to absorb and coordinate all space-related activity. The National Aeronautics and Space Administration was officially born on 1st October 1958. The Navy's Vanguard program continued, but its second launch also failed. In March of 1958, it was third time lucky when Vanguard 1 satellite successfully reached orbit. By the end of the 1950s, the United States still lagged far behind the Soviets, whose economy was developing so fast, it seemed communism was succeeding. With a bragging Khrushchev storming forward into space, it seemed little could be done to stop him. America needed to prove their worth, maintain their world leadership. A new effort to meet the Soviets head-on and surpass their technological advantage in space was needed. The US could not remain second fiddle to the Soviet dominance in space. It required a bold new plan to galvanize the nation and the future. There appeared one likely political leader who had the potential to deliver.
The president takes the burden from the oldest ever to hold the office as America enters the critical and challenging 60s.